Look, I don't really own anything particularly sporty. I mean, this is a Doctor Who hoodie. So, this is as good as I can do it. So, after some pressure from a number of people, some in my comments, but more notably from my boyfriend, I have now seen Heated Rivalry. I'm not going to say I was necessarily going out of my way to resist it, but I wasn't naturally drawn to it. It's sports, it's romance. Neither of these are things that I am particularly drawn to, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that. But he was very insistent, and I've now seen it, all 6 episodes, and it is astoundingly good. It is so good that it has helped me narrow down a lot of what I don't like about most romance stories, because there is stuff that is so common in romance narratives that Heated Rivalry doesn't do. And a lot of these things are just accepted tropes that don't get questions. Some of them are things that when I've complained about it, I've had people actually try and tell me how are you even supposed to have a romance story without that? Well, apparently we can, and it can be amazing. I will get into some of the specifics of what I'm talking about in a little bit. But Heated Rivalry. Let's go over the basics first. This is a show created by Crave Entertainment in Canada, and it is based on the novel of the same name by Rachel Reed. Heated Rivalry is the second book in her Game Changers series of gay hockey romance books. This season that we now currently have also integrates some of the major plot points of the first book in that series called Game Changer. That's also in there, though it takes the title from the second book because that is the majority of what the focus is on for the season. It is proven to be a huge success despite having basically no big names or recognizable faces. The only person in it who I recognized was Dylan Walsh, who I only kind of know because I remember him in trailers for Nip Tuck, a show I never watched, but I was watching FX, the network that it was on at the time, and would see promos for it. But he was literally the only person I recognized in the entire thing. But despite that, and despite being based off some pretty niche and not particularly well-known books, this has blown up huge. Pushed in America because it was picked up by HBO and HBO Max and put onto that streaming service, which helped spread it pretty decently. And yeah, people caught on to how good this was, and word spread fast. Now, before I start getting into what I really like about this, let me address the fact that I generally don't like romances. Now, I say generally because it's not an absolute. Here's what I have historically said about romances. What I don't like is romantic subplots in stories where the romance isn't the focus. This is why I tend to complain about romantic subplots in sci-fi movies, action movies, the things that I'm otherwise drawn to, because I'm not here for the romantic subplot. I'm here for all the other stuff. Like when something like Doctor Who dips into romantic subplots, it tends to annoy me because I don't come to Doctor Who for romantic subplots. I come to Doctor Who for stuff that I can only get here, for the time travel, for the characterization, for the weird aliens, for whatever else. I can get a romantic subplot anywhere, and they tend to bore me. Now, that hasn't been an absolute. There have been shows with romantic subplots that have worked for me, although I have noticed in recent years, most of those, not all, but most, deal with existing dynamics, or I only start liking them once the relationship has settled in a bit. What I actually tend to really not like, especially in a romantic subplot sense, is courting. Once you establish a relationship and there's just a nice dynamic between characters, I can absolutely enjoy that. But the courting process, the awkwardness, the starting to date, the first encounters, it's where all the tropes that I don't like are just loaded up. And I don't enjoy courting as entertainment, especially in subplots. But of course, Heated Rivalry is not a hockey show with a romantic subplot. It's an erotic romance about hockey players. So the romance is not a subplot here. But even when it comes to stories where romance is the primary focus, I'm still really picky. Things that are billed first and foremost as romance stories are not something I find particular appeal in. Like, to give you an idea of my taste in romances, here's some of my favorite romance films: Professor Marston and the Wonder Women, Bound, Don John, Never Let Me Go, The Fountain, Harold and Maude, The Shape of Water. You might notice, by and large, none of these are really especially straightforward and standard in terms of how they handle their romance elements. Probably the closest to standard romance stories that I like are Carol, the African Queen, and Love Actually. Love Actually is honestly the big outlier for me because, well, honestly, firstly, because people have been turning on it over the years for being problematic while I continue to really, really like it. But I did a whole video talking about this. The main thing that I really love about Love Actually is because of the interweaving of multiple storylines. It has to basically only do the good bits, and it cuts out so much of the filler, so often filler that is just cringe comedy, that makes up the bulk of most romantic comedies and turns me off them as a genre. So for me, Love Actually is like a sample platter of the best parts of a genre that I otherwise don't really like. But that one is about the most mainstream that I've got in terms of my taste on this. My interest in sports movies is even closer to being non-existent. I think that is a genre that has pretty much always been something that I've watched because somebody I was with wanted to see it. I don't think there's ever been a single sports movie I've watched because I was like, that looks good. Again, not to say that I haven't enjoyed some, but I can only think of two that I've ever voluntarily rewatched because I liked them enough to watch them a second time. And that's A League of Their Own and Cool Runnings. So this was why I wasn't really keen to jump onto Heated Rivalry. But I did. Wow, I was pushed. And I appreciate the pushes. Because despite natural inclinations that push me away from sports in general, sports movies in particular, romance even as a major focus of something, it's just not something that I expect to enjoy. This won me over almost immediately. Probably the first thing that I noticed right off the bat is this is a show that trusts the audience to be paying attention. It's become a pretty common criticism of a lot of shows, especially shows that are made for streaming, which I'm not sure if this was. I don't know exactly what Crave is, whether that's a premium channel or a streaming service in Canada, but regardless, generally stuff this big is made with the intention of streaming, if not immediately, at least licensing it for that purpose. And it's become a very common thing with streaming, this idea of people are also on their phones. We need to be sure that we have it in dialogue and reiterate the plot so that they don't feel lost if they're not paying attention. This show is the antithesis of that, and not just because it isn't reiterating the plot, even just setting that trend aside, by its own standards, it does so much showing and not a lot of telling because it doesn't have to, because it trusts the audience to get it. I felt that so early on, starting with the scene in the gym with Shane Hollander and Ilya Rozanov just starting to work out next to each other and getting competitive because they just are. But there is a tension in that, and especially when they stop and Ilya hands Shane the water bottle and this happens. To be blunt about it, most other things tackling a moment like this, I would expect a scene, not necessarily immediately, but eventually, either these characters talking to each other or one of the characters talking to somebody else who they trust, having seen this like, and then his hand like touched mine and it lingered, like, what was up with that? And like having to talk through the thing that we saw rather than just letting absorb the fact that we saw it. And with the framing of it, it's very clear that that moment matters. And this just lets it sit. That's far from the biggest or most prominent or most important instance of just letting the moment be and trusting the audience to get it. These things happen across the show. But that was where I noticed early on, like, oh, this thing respects my intelligence. This has expectations of me as a viewer. Oh, that's good. And then, of course, like just the chemistry between these two guys, just looking at each other, and the way shots are framed, and the way that the music just sort of seeps in at times, and also hits you over the head. There are some needle drops that are really on the nose, where the lyrics basically are the moment going on. And you could argue that is a telling as well as showing, but there's kind of a campiness to that I kind of find adorable. If that bugs some people, I get it. That's fine. It doesn't with me. I actually found the incredibly on the nose needle drops kind of endearing. But to come back with the whole showing over telling thing, to give you an idea of how intelligently and smartly this handles its story, I'm actually going to cite an instance of telling even after having shown. Because in the second episode, and yeah, I am going to talk about the whole thing. I'll warn you before I get into like the back half, which is more outright spoiler stuff. But in the second episode, after some very passionate and hot and heavy scenes, there is this moment where Shane starts to text Ilya saying, "We didn't even kiss." And I really love that because, yes, it's true. They had shown us these two men and they weren't kissing. They were being very intimate, but they weren't kissing. Now, even though showing us that, they still chose to tell us, and I think that was the right call. Because, first of all, we're not seeing every single instance of this. We're not getting the full scene. There are, time jumps and jump cuts and everything else. So people might have assumed that at some point they kissed, because they did kiss in their encounter in the previous episode. And so doing that little moment, and especially having it be something that Shane types out but then doesn't send, which also makes it a character beat telling us something about Shane, while also making sure the audience caught that. Because if they didn't, it would lessen their experience. So while this thing knows to trust its audience with moments like the touch, it also recognizes like audiences might miss this, not because they're dumb, but because there's all this other stuff going on. And we can use it that is a moment that also lets us know something about Shane as a character. That is incredibly smart writing when a single moment like that accomplishes multiple things in one stroke. The writing on this overall is really astounding, and actually this is probably a good time to talk about Jacob Tierney. Jacob Tierney is the writer and director of every single episode of this show. Now that is a little bit unusual for a TV series, not so much with something this short. At 6 episodes, this could have theoretically been a mini-series if it didn't get picked up for additional seasons. What's really impressive about this, though, is the combination of everything he did and how little time he had to do it and how little money he had to do it. I mentioned already the lack of recognizable faces or names, and I'm sure that saved them a bunch of money. But even with that in the mix, this was a show that looks so much more expensive than it is. They spent a little over $2 million US per episode of this show. And it looks so much more expensive. Like, it fits that it was picked up by HBO because it has that level of craft in the visuals, and it feels that level of prestige, and it's globe hopping. And I'm sure most of the locations that we go to, the various locations in Russia and so forth, are by and large faked. But at the same time, it still feels way bigger than its budget should allow. And the entire thing was filmed in 36 days. Now, 36 days would be a tight shooting schedule for a 2-hour movie. And this is effectively a 5-hour movie, because each episode is a little bit less than an hour. They actually did approach it like that as well, because they didn't shoot this one episode at a time. They took the entire thing and filmed the entire season like it was a big movie. The filming schedule was determined by actor and location availability and those kinds of logistics, and allowed them to make something this long on an incredibly tight schedule. And again, for something at this budget, 36 days is tight, but not unreasonably so. But you also wouldn't expect something that looks this good, is written this well, is acted this well, for a shooting schedule that tight. If nothing else, the visuals alone feel like they had way more time for setups and prep and everything else. And this must have been a absolute nightmare to plan, because getting this result on that budget and that timeline requires nothing more than masterful planning. Because if you don't know exactly what you're doing, you can't get it done in the time you have for the money you have. It actually, in a lot of ways, speaks to how throwing more money at projects hurts them. Because when you just have more time and money because your Star Wars or your Marvel or your DC or your Game of Thrones or whatever, then you lose the restrictions that forces creators to be tight and specific and have intent. And it allows people to get away with just kind of meandering their way through something because we've got the time and the money to figure this out. When you're on tight schedules and when you're on tight budgets, you have to be certain of what it is that you're doing if you're trying to do something really good. I mean, I don't want to over-glorify the idea of tight schedules and low budgets, because that can also result in just stuff that is thrown together haphazardly because you only have limited time and money. But my overall point is there is a benefit when somebody who is really good at what they do has those restrictions and learns to work within them, as opposed to just throwing unlimited resources at them. This is not a piece of work I would have expected from Jacob Tierney. Prior to this, he was best known as the co-developer and director on the comedy series Letterkenny, and he also directed some episodes of the spin-off from that, Shoresy. I never watched Letterkenny. I have seen clips of it. They make the rounds on TikTok or in short form here on YouTube, and I do tend to get a kick out of them, but I never felt the need to watch full episodes. But I did note every now and then, like, oh, that's a more dynamic shooting setup than just this couple of characters talking to each other while sitting in lawn chairs really needs. But it's not to the degree that I would have expected something as visually arresting as this from the director of those things. It's also probably worth noting at this point that Jacob Tierney is gay. I do think when it comes to queer stories, this is going to be another example that I will point to of what you get when you let queer creators tell queer stories. I'm going to put this up alongside It's a Sin and I Saw the TV Glow as an excellent example of something that would not have worked nearly as well if it A, wasn't a gay story in the first place, and B, wasn't handled by someone who has an understanding of gay culture, gay experiences, the way gay men interact with each other, the way they can bump up against each other, the way things are better or worse for them. There is an intimate understanding, maybe not of the full specifics of this story from personal experience, but you can feel the infusion of a gay man's perspective into this show, and it makes it so much better than it would have been otherwise. So let's really start to dig into some of the specifics that I really like. Elephant in the room, I suppose, the sex scenes. I am not going to be able to show very much, if any, of this stuff, but they are really, really well shot. They do such a good job of finding angles and how much of them to put into frame where it honestly feels like you're watching something more explicit than you actually are. It's sort of the erotic version of the trick that the original Chainsaw Massacre movie pulled, where you just get right up to the edge of seeing something really horrific, but it doesn't actually show it to you on camera, but you're still left with such an impression of it. You felt like you saw something way gorier or way more graphic than you actually did. And this is the erotic version of that. It is pretty extensive in terms of the sex scenes, but at the same time, you don't get any true explicit shots. I don't even think there's a real instance of frontal nudity. I think the only instance is a sexted image, which is just the isolated thing. I don't think we see anybody just full frontal in a scene, but you still feel like you have, because the scenes are so good and so well put together, and there's so much passion in the performances that you feel, well, Honestly, I kind of get why some people say this is basically just acceptable porn. It can feel like that during the sex scenes because they do such a good job of evoking a sense of explicitness without actually being explicit. So while I don't agree with that assessment, I do get where it comes from, and I, for one, feel like it's a compliment. But there's another aspect of the sex scenes that I need to highlight because it is something I have talked about before. Consent. I did a whole video a couple years ago about how rare it is to have scenes of clear, explicit, enthusiastic consent in our entertainment. Most of our entertainment just moves forward on the basis of, oh, these two people start making out because they just know. And look, there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But I do feel there is a vacuum for depicting characters actually clearly establishing consent for a scene, especially a sex scene. And this has multiple instances of characters like on the bed together, already naked, and somebody pausing and goes, "Is this okay?" And you know what it doesn't do? It doesn't kill the mood. That's another thing I've talked about. Consent is sexy. Asking, "Is it okay that I do this to you?" can be so hot. And here it is. And it's done so casually. They don't really stop the scene dead. There's just a quick pause for in these little check-in moments. Are you okay? And they get that affirmation and they keep going. Do you know how long I have been waiting for this casual yet incredibly sexy just vision of consent mid-scene? And I never get it in anything, and it's here. Oh, I think I was already intrigued off the bat with, like, as I mentioned, the trust in the audience, the trusting them to get, the connection. We don't have to stop and talk about this. But it was the pausing of, like, are you okay? Mid-scene that made me realize, even in the first episode, okay, I'm going to love this. And I do. I love this a lot. Let's talk about some of the other reasons why. I already mentioned that Jacob Tierney being gay really benefits the thing, but also, like, I love that this is a story that wouldn't function really at all if it wasn't about gay men in this setting. Because there is a couple of ways to try and tell, well, not just queer romance, any queer story. To tell a story the same way that you would with a straight or cis character and just make them queer. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I will pretty much always prefer when a story is told that really benefits from the inclusion of its queer elements. That the story literally could not be the same without them. And this has that. So you have these two initially rookies, and they have a rivalry between each other, but they also have almost immediate chemistry. And they almost immediately begin a sexual relationship, one that spans about a decade. And I don't think that story would work with straight couples in a different setting, or even in this setting, because the fact that both Shane and Ilya are gay and exist in a world, the world of professional sports, that at the time it is set is a world where you can't be out and gay. That's not a thing that we do. That is what allows for this structure where they cannot wait to see each other when they can, but they can't really make special arrangements to just see each other if they aren't already in the same area. If they didn't just have a hockey match against each other, if they aren't at the same gala event or what have you. Because they have to have their romance, it has to exist in the margins, in the cracks of the life that they are publicly leading. Having it be gay men makes it have an intrinsic sense of, yeah, it would be like that. That if it weren't gay men, you'd have to spend a ton of time justifying why not. you'd have to explain why the hell not? And why is either one of them putting up with this? You'd have to insert something like, well, one of them's married or something else, which would just change the entire energy of the whole thing. It just couldn't be the same story if it wasn't a gay story. And I don't want to give all the credit to Jacob Tierney for that. I obviously haven't read the books, but from my understanding, Rachel Reed's novels are held to pretty closely in these adaptations. So I want to give her credit for this as well. But the overall structure and feel of the thing leans in to the fact that these are gay men facing distinctly gay challenges for the time and the setting that the story takes place in. Yet at the same time, it doesn't fall into a bunch of very tired tropes. Like, I didn't really get into this when I mentioned the fact that I don't super like romance and I don't super like sports movies. I often don't really get drawn to quote unquote gay movies either. Like, I love queer aspects of films and I love queer narratives, but things that are generally billed as gay movies, they just don't appeal to me. Because they're either in a genre that I'm not normally drawn to, be it romance or drama or whatever. Something has to be really good to pull me in when it's a realistic, grounded story. I like my fantastical elements. I like my sci-fi. I like my superheroes. So absent those things, you're already kind of losing me. But otherwise, it often feels like, oh, we're just going to make the gay version of this thing. And by the gay version, we mean we're just going to throw in a bunch of cliched perspectives and moments and gay characters. And this does not feel like it was constructed that way at all. And I adore it for that. Now, another thing that I'm going to spend a while talking about, this is going to be where I start to talk about some of the specifics from episode 3 and on. So this would be more spoilerish stuff if you haven't seen the show already. So that is your warning as I start to get into this, because this next section that I really want to talk about, because this is one of the major things that generally turns me off romance as a genre. And this show doesn't do it. And for me to explain the degree to which it doesn't do it, I need to talk about the whole thing, including stuff in the last episode. So that's your warning. Having said that, nobody's the asshole. I mean, like, Ilya is kind of an asshole, and he has an arc for that, but when I say nobody's the asshole, so many romance stories have one, if not both of the characters just be assholes. If not by some objective metric, at least the asshole of this story. There's almost always one character who is the one who's wrong, the one who needs to change, the one who is too stubborn, too pig-headed, too damaged, if we're really getting to some of the stuff that I don't like. But there's somebody who's the problem, and they have to change so that they can be with the character who's not the problem. Now, that's not 100% in every romance, but it's pretty common with anything where the main obstruction to the romantic characters being together is an outside logistical force, which arguably this does have in the form of the idea that they could ever be publicly known as gay. That doesn't really seem to be on the table, but that's not as much of a encroachment or defining factor for the development of their actual relationship as you might think. But what I mean is something like, say, Romeo and Juliet. The war between these families, that's the logistical obstruction. So you don't necessarily need one of them to be the asshole. Jack and Rose in Titanic, the obstruction is, well, she's engaged to this guy because she and her mother desperately need the money. Oh, and also there's an iceberg. So logistical things that are in their way. So you don't need either Jack or Rose to be the asshole. There has to be some degree of confrontation. There has to be something that is keeping them apart and makes it difficult where they can't just go, I love you, I love you. Oh, that's it. So if it's not an outside force sort of pushing them apart or wedging between them, then generally somebody is going to be the asshole. For examples in this, Heathcliff is the asshole of Wuthering Heights. Edward is the asshole of Twilight. Christian Grey is the asshole of 50 Shades of Grey. Hell, sometimes you get movies like How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days where they're both the asshole. Nobody in this story is the asshole. And I don't just mean between Ilya and Shane. Because like I said, Ilya is kind of an asshole, but we also get a lot of insight into him. We see where his hangups come in. We see why he's distanced. We see why he pulls back, especially after he's had, actual interactions with his family in Russia, which always complicates things. But he's not the reason they can't be together, but he could have been. There's so many versions of this story where Shane opens up and is, there, and Ilya's just like, no, I just want to have sex with you and shove you away. And he doesn't even really play at that. It's not always easy for him to open up, but he's not taken to a degree that he becomes the asshole of the story. And there are multiple other characters who could have easily been the asshole in specific episodes, if not the whole thing. Rose could have been the asshole because when she dates Shane for a bit and then realizes that he's gay, she could have had any number of horrible reactions. She could have been jealous. She could have been hateful. She could have been bigoted. She could have been any of those things. Instead, she's supportive. And she realizes that he's gay because she cares about him and she's been paying attention. And it's very similar as a dynamic between Svetlana and Ilya. They each care about their respective friend because they see and they pay attention and they don't judge. Shane's parents could have been the assholes. I was dreading that because the final episode spends so much time of them just being together at the cottage, and it's beautiful. And then that shot when you realize somebody's in the house and then you see Shane's dad, my heart hit my feet. And he doesn't say anything. He just gets in his car and drives off, and you're like, oh my God, you understand why Shane has this little mini panic attack. But then he goes and sees his parents, and yeah, they're thrown off. They're a little confused, but they're way more confused about the fact that Shane is with Ilya specifically.
And there were no nice men in Montreal?
I don't know. Probably there were.
Because their whole rivalry as hockey players has been played up so much for everybody. That is what is most confusing to them. Not the idea that Shane's gay, or even the idea that Ilya is. They're just more thrown off by, wait, him? Really? But ultimately, they're supportive. I'd say the only character who's just flat out the asshole is Ilya's brother, but he is such a minor character. He's important for background information and understanding Ilya, but he is so peripheral that he can't be the asshole of the story. He's just the biggest asshole that Ilya personally has to deal with. Even with the additional story that we get between Scott and Kip, it is such a hard call for me as to whether I think episode 5 or episode 6 is the best one, because the conclusion to Scott and Kip's story, which I wasn't even sure we were going to get. I thought episode 3 might have been a completely self-contained thing, giving us Scott's story and him meeting somebody, meeting this barista, getting close to them, but then they start to fall apart slowly because of things neither of them can help. Scott can't tell the world, and he's not ready to even think about doing that, but Kip isn't okay with being a secret. But neither of them blows up at the other over that. There's no big blowout argument between the two of them. And there easily could have been. Even the moments where Scott kind of shuts down, they go to this art show and he suddenly leaves and Kip's like, it's okay. And Scott's like, no, it's not. I know it's not. I couldn't help it, though. I thought I could be okay, but I wasn't. He's aware of the problems. They're both aware of the problems, but they both love each other. But there's that gap. There's things that they can't fix, and the amount that they love each other doesn't mean that these problems go away. And nobody's the asshole. It's just not working. At least right now. And then we get episode 5 where Scott has won the cup. He's achieved the highest moment within his professional career he will probably ever achieve. And in that moment, he just has this look on his face of, if not now, when? If what I was afraid of was losing my career, I've hit my high point. It's all downhill from here anyway. And Kip didn't have to be in the audience. but he was. Kip wasn't there thinking Scott would do this. And Kip wasn't around because like he was waiting for Scott. They each moved on, but Scott had that moment and took the biggest swing he was ever going to take in his life, and Kip was there. And it's so beautiful. And I love the way that it immediately impacts both Shane and especially Ilya, because he sees that happen. And he just tells Shane yes to the offer that he'd been given previously about going to and spending time at the cottage with him.
I'm coming to the cottage.
It was something he wasn't going to do before, but he sees that and he's like, it is possible. Like, is he ready to do what Scott did? No, he's not. But there's a path forward. He doesn't have to be the first anymore. And Scott's acceptance of his award, where he talks about there are going to be people out there who will see what I did and realize there's a place for them in this world because I am that thing that other players say to each other as an insult, but I'm here anyway. And the immediate impact of that moment on Ilya is again showing, and later being told by Scott, because I think is worth reiterating, but we are shown in the moment why representation, especially in spaces that don't normally have it and you wouldn't expect it, is so important. Because anybody who is those things, who is gay, who is queer, who loves hockey but assumes that it can't be a world in which they can be themselves because they don't see anyone else like themselves in that world, this is so important, and it is a microcosm of why representation matters. It is demonstrated so astoundingly well in that instance. And again, Kip and Scott, they do get together again, but even if they hadn't, I still would have considered that a beautiful story just with what happens in the third episode. Because nobody's the asshole. Like, that's not to say every character is perfect. Every character has their flaws. Kip, Scott, Ilya, Shane, everyone has their issues here or there, but nobody is the villain of the story. It's just about getting these people moved along in their own journey so that they can be at a position and be at a place within themselves where they can say what they feel and take what they want. And it's a journey. It's, for Ilya and Shane, a decade-long journey. And watching it unfold over the course of these 6 episodes is so heartwarming. That specific aspect, the idea that, well, if there isn't a logistical hurdle keeping them apart, well, then somebody has to be deeply flawed. That's the kind of thing that I've been told. You know, when I say I hate that this person is such a jerk and I don't really want them to be happy, I've been told by people who like romances, well, somebody has to be that. Because otherwise, like, they just get together. And then I watch this and nobody is that. And it's phenomenal. This has helped me solidify so much of what I normally don't like about romance, because it doesn't do it. And it just gives me a story about characters that I get to know really well as they get to know each other. And I understand the stakes and I understand the risks. And nothing is blown up to this level where it detaches me. Not the circumstances and not the people. Everybody is flawed, but nobody is so over the top flawed that I no longer want happiness for them. I loved falling into this show. It's not going to make me start watching a bunch of romance stuff. Like, it's just not. Because as I said, this didn't wake me up to like, oh, I do like romance. No, this just kind of wisened me up to, oh, there really are a ton of tropes that most romance do that I hate. And this isn't doing them, but it's the exception. And I know that. Are there other things out there like this? Probably. But I'm not going to go wading through all the stuff that I don't like to try and find this. This is a diamond in the rough, but the rough had already been cleared. Other people have found the diamond and pushed it at me. And I am really glad I saw it. I'm really, really glad that I got to take this in. And got to take it in not really having anything spoiled about it for me either. For as much praise as I saw about this, not a ton of the specifics were spoiled for me, which is also nice. When I find something in a genre that I don't normally engage with that really clicks with me, it's honestly a really nice feeling. Because it's a reminder that I'm not just narrow-minded and like closed off to a genre. I just don't enjoy a lot of stuff that is common to that genre, but I can still find something that's like, okay, that though. That feels like that was for me. And obviously in the case of this, it was also for a whole lot of other people. This was a huge hit and it deserved to be. And I just had to gush about it. Am I bringing anything new to this conversation? Probably not. I don't care. I wanted to gush. You get a video. What did you think of Heated Rivalry? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can help me out that way, like, share, subscribe, all that usual stuff, that helps me out, but don't worry too much about it. What I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons. Robin Moore, Jared Boyce, Zubin Lafula, Auntie Kate 808, Mira G, Angry Casperel, Dave Hall, Oliver B, Mystic Shadow, Sean Miller, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Melissa Pedersen, Pickapok, Becky Sparks, Ulrich, Twylord, Tracy Scrabbit, Palber, Rabajoggle, Cindy Ella, Sir Didymus is my favorite, and thanking some random folks from my lower tiers of support. Thank you, Pippa Barwell, Mandy Walla, and Jessica, the Trans Metal Alchemist. The boys are back, and we've got a new one here. We have Navarro has joined the mischief. Okay, so that's just what we're doing now. All right.